From WNPR, I'm John Dankosky, and this is The Wheelhouse.
Multiple federal officials telling NBC News that the Clinton emails referred today by FBI Director Comey were found as part of an ongoing investigation into Anthony Weiner, of course.
I have great respect for the fact that the FBI and the Department of Justice are now willing to have the courage to right the horrible mistake that they made.
The director himself has said he doesn't know whether the emails referenced in his letter are significant or not.
On this day at least, you don't have to pay attention to Michelle and healthy eating. And in fact, the more candy, the later you eat the candy, the better.
You can join the conversation about the week's news at 860-275-7266. Comment on our website, wnpr.org/The Wheelhouse. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. Joining me today, as always, is Colin McEnroe. He's the host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Hi there, Colin.
You know, when I listen to President Obama say that, I worry that around January 18th he's going to start smoking again. It's like, okay, I'm not president anymore. Just throw all this stuff out the window.
We'll see what actually happens then. Dan Haar is here. He, of course, covers commerce, economics, wealth, and poverty for the Hartford Courant. He's a columnist there. Hi there, Danny.
Hello. Still on a sugar high.
Of course. And Leah Wright-Ruger is with us. She's assistant professor of public policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Business. She joins us, Kennedy School of Government. She joins us today from Harvard University. Hello there, Leah.
Hi, it's always good to be on the show.
Yeah, it's good to be with you as well. So I suppose we're going to start with emails. The Anthony Weiner investigation has possibly created a big problem for Hillary Clinton just in the days before this campaign finally, mercifully, comes to an end. FBI Director Comey looking into these emails sent between Huma Abedin and Clinton on her infamous private server. Of course, these are all tied to Anthony Weiner, the estranged husband of Ms. Abedin. This is 11 days or so before the election. Obviously caused some backlash against Comey. And had you sort of going back and forth about this, Colin, over the course of a few days, because I think a lot of people, a lot of Democrats certainly, were very upset at the FBI director. Then you start to look a little bit more closely. I mean, where do you fall on the Jim Comey spectrum right now?
Yeah, well, there certainly is a Jim Comey spectrum. I guess I do feel as though, he was in a little bit of a bind. On the other hand, to have written the letter that he wrote, not having even seen one email, strikes me as precipitous and unnecessary. And I also understand we live in an age of leaks, and that one of his concerns was that this was not necessarily a set of information that he could control indefinitely. That even if it made sense to him to hold back until he knew more, that he felt as though it could come out the wrong way, that would be a big problem. There probably wasn't a win for him anywhere in this, but I think he's going to go down as a guy who really made a pretty gigantic error and violated some of the basic precepts of the Justice Department. But there's always going to be a pretty good counter-argument to that, too.
Do you agree, Lee? Is this just a gigantic error, or was he put in such a bind that the FBI director had nothing else to do?
I think it's all of the above. I've seen some interesting explanations that argued, that suggested that he was obligated to give an update, but it didn't need to look like that. It was ambiguous, it was vague, the timing. But at the same time, there's a certain measure of, something in the fact that Anthony Weiner, maybe of all people, may be the person who kind of like destroys Hillary Clinton. He's been a pain since day one. And I think that some of the things that have come out about him are worth, he's being investigated for really horrific charges. But does it have to do with the Clintons, and does it have to do with everything else? No, but it's really just a mess right now. Yeah,
I actually we remember this from some time ago here in Connecticut, Danny. There was a mayor, Phil Giordano, who was being investigated for some not so horrific charges having to do with corruption in Waterbury. But they kind of had to jump in on that investigation because of some really horrific things that it turned out that he was accused and then convicted of.
I recall the day when President George Bush visited Waterbury, and Giordano was not in the room at all. He was not allowed in the school. He was nowhere near the scene at all. And we were outside I was hanging around with the trucks. It must have been winter. I was in the TV trucks, and everybody was watching and say, gee, where's Giordano? Where's Giordano? And we didn't know at the time what happened, and we speculated it was because Roland was angry at him for running for Senate, and it turns out it was the much more horrific thing. Here's a case where Hillary Clinton tragically comically, tragically, she could be done in by two men who can't keep their shorts on. But on the serious side, if this causes her to lose the election or to even come close to lose the election, it's her fault as a campaigner. And it's not. It shouldn't have come to this because this is such an obvious foil.
Colin?
Predictions, of course, are doomed in this particular cycle, but I think it's not going to cause her to lose the election. I mean, the polls were starting to tighten right when this happened. Wiener or no Wiener, emails or no emails, the polls were tightened. And I do think that what you see here is in a situation in which it's hard to have a bombshell when there's a fireworks display going on every single day. And so this has been an unusual cycle in the sense that there's just news, often quite lurid or vivid news about this campaign every single day. Trump has tweeted something or she's passed out at a 9/11 ceremony. Something wacky or weird happens every day. So, October surprises for the most part don't really have a big effect on election outcomes as far as anybody can tell. And I think it's going to be really hard for this one to do it because it isn't even the first October surprise. I mean, the Billy Bush bus thing, that happened in October too. Now we're into November. It's such an information-saturated environment that one new piece of information has a hard time making an impact.
But Lee, I would say, years and years ago when we all gathered together in central locations to vote, and there was no such thing as early voting or large numbers of people voting by absentee ballot, you would have an October surprise or not, and you would then figure out who had the last shot to make their case, who is doing damage control at the end, and then there would be a vote. But there have been millions and millions and millions of votes cast, including in swing states and battleground states already. The fact that this changing landscape of news is happening, it's happening with the backdrop of people are voting with the latest allegation hot in mind, maybe before the next allegation comes to the newspapers.
Right, and I think at this point, I think I agree with what Colin and Dan were saying, which is that at this point, it's not really changing the race. For people who are supporters of Clinton, this makes them very angry. For people who are supporters of Trump, this also makes them very angry and kind of helps them double down. We've seen historically that October surprises, with the exception of a few, really don't move anything. I'm specifically thinking of Bush and the DUI, which comes out right around November 2nd, and he still goes on to win the election. But I think in the cases where it does change is something like Barack Obama, John McCain, and the economy collapsing. Right? That's not necessarily an October surprise. It's the collapse of the economy. And so I think by now what you're seeing is again all of this news coming out. People have already made up their minds. They made up their minds before really the first debate. And really what this does is just harden those preconceived beliefs for their candidate of choice as we move towards, Election Day.
Dan, you're talking to a lot of people. I mean, has everyone really made up their minds? I'm obviously always very skeptical of the quote-unquote undecided voter. I don't believe these people really actually exist. I know that there are a few of them out there. They seem to show up on CBS in groups with Frank Luntz, and they can never make up their mind about anything. I don't know that they exist. Do you think that they're out there still undecided?
They're in smaller and smaller percentage. I was at a forum yesterday. There were maybe 75 people. It was a lunch forum organized by another radio station. Sorry about that. There were 3 undecided voters. We asked. There were 3 undecided voters in the audience. My concern is not with the undecideds. It's with the cores staying home. And the enthusiasm gap obviously remains much more severe on the Democratic side, especially with black voters. And that's part of the problem, not so much the undecideds, but the staying home factor.
I just want to quickly, before we turn too far from these FBI investigations and emails, something that we hadn't ever thought about, Colin, really was Jim Comey's connections to Connecticut. Really? I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, he lived in Westport. He worked at Bridgewater Associates as his previous job. Bridgewater Associates is famous for lots of things. A 2011 piece by John Cassidy in The New Yorker described how people called it a cult because Ray Dalio, the chairman, has this thing called The Principles, and it's 100 pages. I think it was described in another profile. email, as if Ayn Rand and Deepak Chopra combined to write fortune cookies. So who knows? I mean, James Comey may be under some kind of mind control, and I wouldn't exempt Dan Haar from this either. When you really think about some of the things he says, they sound an awful lot like Ayn Rand and Deepak Chopra fortune cookies.
I follow Ray Dalio directly. Actually, on Bridgewater, it's important to note that that New Yorker article and other things about Bridgewater have made the point that it is radical transparency that is at the heart of what makes that outfit what it is. And so if this is an example of radical transparency coming out of the hedge fund world, then we have a little bit of an overlay.
Okay, radical transparency. Very nice segue, Danny. Like a radio professional, the Hartford Region's Water and Sewer Agency has invoked a little-used federal Department of Homeland Security anti-terrorism restriction to block citizens' access to once what was public information about its water supply system. So critics have blasted this legal maneuver by the Metropolitan District Commission, known as the MDC, to have its water supply plan designated as, quote, protected critical infrastructure information by the Homeland Security Department. This comes under a post 9/11 program designed to prevent damage to public facilities by terrorists. Since then, they have now backed down. They won't fight the release of this information. Colin, I bring this up now because as we look at this world of emails we can't see and FBI investigations we can't know anything about, it seems as though every day at the local, at the state, at the federal level, there is another story about someone conspiring to keep information that we're supposed to know from us.
Right, and there is a connection here. I mean, I get in trouble every time I say something like this, and I mean, I do intend to vote for Hillary Clinton, but I mean, this email thing really, when you track it all the way back, it's about basically somebody who wants to avoid FOI laws, wants to avoid public scrutiny of what should be public emails. The MDC thing, and props to John Lender for writing about it.
Yep.
This is, if there's ever an agency, a quasi-public, that needed radical transparency, that needed a lot of scrutiny, a lot more scrutiny than it's getting right now, as opposed to a lot less, it's the MDC. And it really is a situation now where people have a lot of conspiracy theories about the MDC. I get emails all the time about them, and unlike most of the conspiracy theory emails I get, I don't tell these people to go away or put a tinfoil hat on. I say, I don't know, you might be right. Anything might be true because they're a very secretive organization, and they've now used the cloak of Homeland Security to block access to really basic information like how much water they have. And how much water they have, first of all, is something we have every right to know, but second of all, it's very germane to this public debate that's probably a lost cause right now, where they're going to sell bottled water. They're going to allow a bottling plant to draw directly from their reservoirs. And the reason that they're doing that, the argument that they gave was they sort of had too much water, and for some reason they needed to sell more water. I think one of the reasons we need to open their books a little bit more, like, why would they need to sell more water? Why do they need more cash than they have? But I mean, this whole argument was followed by a drought here in Connecticut, where the governor was saying stuff like, try to conserve water. Don't use so much water.
We don't have enough water. Try to conserve water.
The idea of throwing a cloak all over all this right now seems really kind of obnoxious.
Danny?
So Colin, if I hear him correctly, Colin is saying that God created a drought to pay back the MDC for its secrecy. Is that what I'm hearing?
I would be willing to go with that. Yeah.
Okay.
I'd have to talk to my pastor first about it, but I think that's how I feel.
I have a slightly different view of MDC than most people. Obviously, it is a totalitarian, closed, call it whatever you want. It may be, and it may be a closed, secretive infrastructure regional agency, but it's our closed secretive infrastructure regional agency. My view of MDC is they have in addition to supplying water, they do lots of other things that they either should or shouldn't be doing. One of the things they do that's a good thing is they run the region's best park system, and they have threatened to close it before. And that was when the unfortunate incident happened with the bicycle rider who unfortunately won a settlement of $2.9 million by running into a thing that everybody could see. There are other reservoir systems and other regions that are much more closed than ours is. And so for a trade-off, I'm okay with MDC doing whatever it pretty much wants to do. The information that we get is not so good, but it's okay. All kidding aside, the park system is amazing. They don't have to keep it open. I'd like to see them keep it open. That's something we use. Information about the water system.
But it doesn't really have to be a trade-off, too. They could keep their park system open and tell us what they're doing.
The problem is they don't have to keep they don't have to keep the park system open.
Well, Leah, I just want to ask you about this in the context of this notion of radical transparency. I mean, look, people in our business are always going to look for as much open information from government as possible, and sometimes we don't like what we see. We do seem to be entering an era in which we are fighting on all fronts to try to get that information, and I don't think it's going back. I mean, how much does that bother you as someone who studies how government works, that we see so much of this hiding of what is clearly public information?
Well, not only that. I mean, I'm the one half the time making the FOIA request, right? The Freedom of Information Act request, and trying to get these, trying to get around barriers, and really getting stymied at every opportunity. So, in some regards, and I think that the national conversation over emails also raises this. It gives us a measure of transparency that people who are studying this and who are looking at this are really hungry for. At the same time, and in particular, this is, I think, in the national case, and the local case, this is a little slightly different. But there's a conversation to be had about ethics and a conversation to be had about kind of the morals of obtaining this, and it's something that we have to wrestle with. But I think in the interest of transparency, I really want to know what's going on in these moments that where the public is supposed to be aware.
We're talking today with Leah Wright Rigueur, who's an assistant professor of public policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, Dan Haar from the Hartford Courant, Colin McEnroe from the Colin McEnroe Show. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about Donald Trump on the campaign trail. He's been backing off some of his talk about a rigged election because, when the FBI director comes out and sort of helps him along, maybe it's not so rigged anymore. But he's also talking about some inconvenient racial truths out there. We'll talk about that. We can also get some of your phone calls at 860-275-7266 in the Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. Today we're talking with Leah Wright Rigueur from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. She joins us from Harvard today. Dan Haar is here from the Hartford Courant, and of course Colin McEnroe, who always joins us on Wednesday. So Colin, what's on your show at 1 o'clock today?
Our show today is about burglars. It's about the way in which burglars study the built environment of our world, and in many cases are quite gratified by how we build our cities and our suburban environments.
Okay, so burglars, I guess you can call in this afternoon at 1 o'clock on the Colin McEnroe Show.
Right, you can call in if you're a burglar. We have a safecracker
on. And that should be good this afternoon. Today we're talking about all sorts of things. I suppose burglary has been part of the conversation so far. Talking a little bit about the race for the presidency entering this last week. Donald Trump last Wednesday made his pitch once again to Black America, a new deal aimed just at them. He says, "I will be your greatest champion." He said at a campaign rally in North Carolina, "I will never, ever take the African-American community for granted. Never, ever." Now, he does say never, ever an awful lot, Leah, but I was reading, and I'm sure you saw too, a piece by Nicole Hannah-Jones in the New York Times about this idea, this long-standing idea that the Democratic Party takes the African-American community for granted. Essentially, what she's saying in this piece, I'll just quote a little bit here. Whatever his motives, Trump was talking about the black working class in a way that few national politicians do. By now, it's no surprise that when they talk about black Americans at all, Republican politicians typically conflate blackness with poverty, then quickly blame black people for their struggles. Later on, she says, but far too often the way Democrats talk to and about black Americans is indistinguishable from the way their Republican counterparts do. And she goes on to say essentially that President Obama, the first black president, has used some of this same language. What do you make of this argument that Donald Trump is essentially saying, look, black America, you can vote for me because I won't take you for granted the way the Democrats have for hundreds of years?
So the interesting thing, and it's an excellent piece in the magazine, the interesting thing about this is that Donald Trump, we know by now that he's largely speaking to his base and to white audiences when he makes this pitch. But he's also doing something, and this came out in an article last week, he's also doing something that is designed to depress black turnout, right? So he's talking about things, and he's very good at taking a kernel of truth, wrapping it in hyperbole, wrapping it in kind of big explosive untruths, and then pitching it out into the outer sphere. Right. The interesting thing here is that what he's trying to do is pick up on these criticisms and these frustrations that African Americans have long had with the Democratic Party. So in essence, he's not necessarily saying, hey, vote for me, Donald Trump. He's saying, don't vote, period. But I think in one of the ways, and this is a relatively this is a pretty strong, and if turnout is any indication, depressed turnout is any indication, he is tapping into these grievances that African Americans have with longstanding treatment from Democratic politicians. I mean, inequality has gotten worse over the last 20 years. So the black-white wealth gap has actually gotten worse. The intra-racial black class gap, so the gap between the middle class and the black poor, has gotten worse. Trump may be exaggerating when he says that 45% of African-American youth are unemployed, but the actual figure is about 26%, right? So he's saying these kind of all over, off-the-wall things. But he is tapping into something that some very real frustrations from these various communities that really neither party has dealt with in a astute way since the 1970s.
Yeah, I think one way that I've heard some political observers, Leah, look at what is the expected black turnout for this election is that, well, you don't have the excitement of President Obama in 2008 or again 4 years later. But I think that, as you put it very well, there's also the fact that many people are looking at what has happened over the course of the last 8 years and whether or not their lives have substantively gotten better. And many of them are probably saying, I don't know that they have.
Right, and I don't think you can. So the difficult thing here is that the campaign continues to point to say, the employment numbers, the low unemployment numbers, but unemployment isn't necessarily a good measure of struggle or inequality or continuing issues with wealth. And I think this is part of the frustration that emerges in terms of talking about depressed turnout or lowered turnout. When you combine this, I think, with African Americans, particularly young African Americans, young Latinos, young Asian voters, and young white millennial voters, many of whom kind of idealistically voted for Barack Obama in 2008, saying, we're frustrated and disappointed with, what happened over the course of these, first in 2012, over the course of these 4 years, and then later, and then not necessarily having the same level of enthusiasm for a Hillary Clinton that they had for a Barack Obama, or even in some cases a Bernie Sanders.
I think it's inevitable that there's going to be a fall off in black participation in this election. The question is whether obviously it's 20% of all voters. And that's where the margin lives. I think you have to be careful about ascribing too much importance to inequality and rising inequality. It can be a sign of progress, sadly, because it's not true in this economy that a rising tide lifts all boats. A rising tide lifts some boats, and when that happens, there is inequality. So it may not necessarily be a sign of worsening conditions in any given community, whether it's the black community or any other, that there's rising inequality. So Trump, I think he's doing an old saw here. The Republicans for years have been saying to the Democratic base groups, they're not helping you, they're not helping you. The difference is he hasn't got the slightest idea what to say beyond that.
So I think, Leah, you might have been referring to this fascinating piece by Joshua Green and Sasha Eisenberg about the Project Alamo, which is the Trump data bunker. I'll just quickly read this. On October 24th, Trump's team began placing spots on select African-American radio stations. In San Antonio, a young staffer showed off a South Park-style animation he'd created of Clinton delivering the Super Predator line using audio from her original 1996 soundbite as cartoon text popped up around her. Hillary thinks African Americans are super predators. The animation will be delivered to certain African American voters through Facebook dark posts, non-public posts whose viewership changed the campaign controls, whose viewership the campaign controls. And they're saying, we know because we've modeled this, it will dramatically affect her ability to turn these people out. That's their quote, these people. So Trump, first of all, this is sort of standard party politics in a way, right? Democrats try to turn out people who are less likely voters. That's that's how their voting operations have gone for years, because people who are marginalized and less likely to vote are more likely to identify with the Democratic message. This is being just writ large here and now, and it's Republicans often do try to suppress that kind of voting. The way that Trump's trying to do it, it may be in multiple ways, including intimidation at the polls, but also, just messaging. See what Danny and Leah have been saying. Just see if they can cut into the enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton.
Leah, quick thought?
Yeah, so the exactly what Colin said, which is this is not a new tactic. We see this in '76, and we see this again in 1980, which is generally that when candidates want to kind of, they want to stay away from reactionary votes or depressed turnout, they will do everything within their power to really, cull that vote. And so this is not necessarily unique. I think what's unique about Trump is the negative approach that he's taking to doing this. One last quick thought here is that even as we're seeing depressed black voter turnout, which should be no surprise, we're actually seeing really high Latino turnout, exceeding the 2012 levels. So there's a way in which this coalition, the Democratic coalition, may in fact be shifting in 2016.
I want to move on to something that Danny's been writing about. A very interesting speech given by Gregory Hayes to the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. Hayes from UTC defended the company's decision to move jobs from subsidiary carrier, waded into the national debate over trade policy. He says the forces of globalization are real and they are inescapable. The genie truly is out of the bottle and it's not really open to debate. Globalization has happened and it will continue apace. Essentially, Danny arguing that all of the talk that certainly Donald Trump, certainly Bernie Sanders, and to a certain extent Hillary Clinton has engaged in over the course of this campaign is, it's rolling against some of the tide that has, resulted in an awful lot of American jobs and an awful lot of American economic growth.
Greg Hayes, the United Technologies CEO, said yesterday in that forum, which, by the way, was moderated by Zoe Baird, former Farmington resident of Nannygate fame.
1992.
That's right. He alluded to his predecessor, George David, the CEO of United Technologies, who also believed that globalization was inevitable and non-debatable. In the era of George David, that was correct. The world has changed. People are starting to realize, and this is not dissimilar to the conversation we just had about black communities and the degree to which they can be, is there a debate in among the parties? And that was a big part of that article in the Times Magazine. Can that be debated? What party they're predominantly voting? It now is open to debate, and it's open to debate because the fringes on the left and the right are no longer the fringes. And the benefits of globalization, as we saw obviously with Brexit, as we see with the Sanders and Trump candidacies, is there's more and more anger. And when you get more and more anger, you get more and more irrational policy. It is irrational to cut off global trade, to free trade. It is irrational to have tariffs. They don't work economically. We know that in theory. We're nonetheless going to get it, and we are going to have a debate if the benefits of trade are not accruing deeply enough in the population, and that's what is happening, and that's what Greg Hayes is not seeing.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the easiest way to think about this, and I need an easy way to think about this because I'm not smart about it, is not enough what people do well under globalization, particularly here in the United States. Not enough people do well. Too many people are left behind. So what do you do about that? Well, I mean, in fact, Hayes is saying, don't expect us to fix this. We're like everybody else, and we're going to have to ship some of these jobs to other places. That's just the way that works. And so that's an argument for innovation here. It's a kind of disruptive innovation that for the most part we haven't seen. We haven't had the leadership for it. I mean, there's a way to revive manufacturing, highly skilled manufacturing in the United States, but you really have to be willing to go after the existing paradigm, and that's going to be scary for a lot of people. I'm not sure Hillary Clinton's going to be the person who does that. I am sure Donald Trump is incapable of doing that.
But before I get a word from Leah, just quickly, Danny, I mean, do you believe that highly skilled manufacturing is something that can come back to America in large enough numbers that it'll make a difference?
Not in large enough numbers. So far, it's a boutique issue. The underlying problem here is cheap consumer goods. We're addicted to cheap consumer goods. As long as that happens, we'll continue to see work move to cheaper and cheaper places. China, by the way, is facing an exodus of manufacturing to cheaper safer places.
Okay, so where do you see the politics in this, Lee? I mean, you have both campaigns to a certain extent talking down trade deals. Hillary Clinton says, I don't support the TPP. Donald Trump talks about the TPP. People on both sides talk about it as though they know what's actually in that particular trade deal, which most of America doesn't. It has nothing to do, for instance, with China. I mean, are the politics of this really having any resonance with people other than just we don't want to see jobs going overseas, we want to see them here in America?
I think that's the relative extent of it, right? So you do have the policy wonks, the people who are really kind of interested in the mechanics and the nuts and bolts of this, but largely this is being used as an issue, a political issue. And I think there are a couple of things that emerge out of this, which is that if Hillary Clinton does win next week, there is going to be a real, I'll call it a conversation within the Democratic Party and within the various wings about, support. I mean, the president still sits, I think, he still supports these measures and will want to endorse them. And I think Hillary Clinton has come out and, changed her position on this in part in a bid to win over those voters who were, from the Bernie camp and from the kind of who are concerned about these things. On the right, I have absolutely no idea what is ultimately going to happen there, in part because for Donald Trump, this is purely a political issue, right? There's no real depth behind it, aside from the fact that it sounds really good to say these things. There's no conversation about what globalization actually means for people in the United States and how to address this. I think in what Colin said, in innovative and forward-thinking ways.
Well, I think, Danny, there's depth behind it from Donald Trump in the sense that he actually knows what it's like to take jobs and move them overseas and create products that are then sold back to America after having been made in China. I mean, he's kind of an expert at that.
Look, he's the one who's been slamming Greg Hayes, not by name, for these 1,400 jobs. And if you look at his solution, it's we're going to slap a big tariff on them every time. But the problem is that the supply chain system for things like commercial air conditioning, jet engines, helicopters, the supply chains for these things are so complicated that it's very difficult to do a value-added tax on movement of parts around the world. It becomes an expense in and of itself. And so his policy prescription is so oversimplified, as with all of his policies that are a joke, that it becomes impossible. You can't. He's trying to separate the rhetoric from the solution. Hillary Clinton is stuck in the solution and doesn't have the rhetoric.
Right. And so, proof of this is that, going back to our first segment, every time Hillary Clinton has a bad day, as she did with Jim Comey recently, the markets drop like rocks because they're really afraid of Donald Trump, because they feel as though he doesn't understand any of this stuff, that he's perfectly capable of, in bull in a China shop fashion, enacting a whole lot of measures that will have consequences that he doesn't easily foresee or understand. Exactly the kind that Dan just described.
Yeah, it's funny, actually. The markets were dropping so badly on that day, we actually put CNBC on one of the televisions in the newsroom. I have to remember to turn that off. There's all these screaming nitwits all the time, waving their hands as the numbers go up and down.
It's no way to talk about Lawrence Kudlow.
Those nitwits run the planet.
Danny's best friend. So, Dan, let's talk about something that hits a little bit closer to home. You've been writing about how the GOP hopes for taking over the state Senate may be hitting a little bit of a road bump. I mean, how much of it does it have to do with Donald Trump? How much of it does it have to do with the candidates that they're running? We're just talking about 4 seats. We're talking about a Republican Party that is dealing with a very, very unpopular governor right now. They would like to see some sort of a balance in state government. Do you think they're actually going to be able to pick up these seats?
No, they're not going to be able to pick up the 4 seats. There was there was a real but not immediate hope over the summer that the 4 seats could be had. There are 11 state Senate seats that are, everybody agrees, are more or less not safe. Right. So of the 36 seats, let's just say there are 25 that are safe, and the remaining 11 are fought over to a greater or lesser extent. And as it happens, 5 democratically held seats are among those seats. So it can be 7. I shouldn't have said 5. So it can be had. There's a former senator, Len Suzio in Meriden, who's challenging a sitting senator. Those races have been close. There are a couple of Democrats who are considered beatable, been there a long time. Trump is hurting these candidates because at forums where they go, as we saw with one last week where Lansuzio refused to answer the question, when a person asks them, a voter asks them, do you favor Donald Trump, before they get out of the box, they're stuck. Because unless they're Art Linares, who's running as a Trump supporter, most of them are not openly running as Trump supporters. And you can say that Trump is equal to Hillary in terms of appeal. I disagree, but you can say it. The fact is no Democrat is embarrassed to say, I support Hillary Clinton.
Colin?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm so torn because, in fact, I feel as though they should be able to flip the Senate. You know, like if they were better at what they do, they should be able to flip the Senate. But Dan's done actual reporting on this. I haven't, so I'm inclined to believe what he says. I think this is a point Dan was going to get to, but it might not be a bad thing if they did flip the Senate. One of the questions that I have, both at the state and the national level, is how are these people going to work together? How are they going to function? I mean, there's some problems that need to be addressed right away at the federal level. Certainly, maybe immigration reform, definitely infrastructure, and also fixing the Affordable Care Act. I mean, that has to be done immediately. We can't, as opposed to like having a lot of hearings about emails in Benghazi and stuff like that. We can't do that. We have to work together for the public. And that has to happen at the state level, too. I mean, we have a broken budget, a broken financial system, and broken infrastructure. And it's going to take bipartisan. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know who the heroes are going to be in this because I don't really see any great thinkers or leaders in this bunch. But at least they got to work together, and maybe it would be good if the House went Republican.
There's less and less partisanship at the state level because the problem is more and more a sort of a technocratic issue, and that's why we're seeing among the Democratic senators people like Joe Crisco are not ideological per se. And so there's hope for not just bipartisan, but really nonpartisan solution. That's what we saw this year with the Democrats' budget, which the Republicans opposed for reasons other than that it cut spending.
I'm hoping that it can just be bi-stupid instead of uni-stupid.
I like that. I like that.
Well, so Lee, I mean, zooming out to the national level on this, I mean, do people really want balanced government? Because what may come with balanced government is more gridlock. Maybe it will come with the need to reach some bipartisan consensus. I mean, we always talk about that's what America wants. Is it really what we want?
I mean, yes and no. So America does. I mean, if we look at surveys and if we look at polls, people largely think balance is good. They think it's good for government. They think it's good for politics, the whole competition thing. But they also do not want obstructionism. They don't want gridlock. And in fact, this has been the real frustration with the American public, right? When they say that they're dissatisfied with American politics and they hate, American politics, they're really talking about obstructionism and they're really talking about nothing happening. They want things to be done. So they want efficient and they want legislatures and politicians that actually do things. And so I think, if we were moving beyond the ideological and in some ways actually, weirdly, Donald Trump has been good for creating these interesting little coalitions, I don't know if you call them bipartisan or something altogether, that are really rooted in kind of a pragmatic dislike of the candidate and an understanding about moving forward in some areas. But, I think Americans want things to happen and they're sick of things not happening.
I was going to say maybe the first successful third party in American history, the pragmatic dislike party. We'll see how that takes off maybe in a couple of years. We're talking with Leah Wright-Rigueur from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, Dan Haar from the Hartford Courant, our own Colin McEnroe. When we come back, we're going to take a look at what we might see actually at the polls. Long lines, high turnout in Connecticut. We'll find out next in the Wheelhouse. This is the Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. We're here with a very feisty Colin McEnroe and Dan Haar, who's from the Hartford Courant. Leah Wright-Rigueur is an assistant professor of public policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. She joins us from Harvard today. We're here with the cameras of CTN, the Connecticut network. So voting day in Connecticut and all across the country coming up in just a few short days from now. Of course, Colin, here in Connecticut, there's no early voting. There is some concern about long lines. We always have concerns about some of the polling places not having enough ballots, not being able to actually conduct an election in a way that we would like them to conduct an election. I mean, what should we be looking for next Tuesday here in the state?
Chaos.
Chaos.
That's why they play the games, John. Actually, we don't have early voting, but I think about 10% of the state typically votes absentee ballots. I just found out today, courtesy of Neil Vigdor, that also you can do this thing. I had no idea you could do this, but you can cancel your absentee ballot. You can sort of say at a certain point, I'm going to go to the polls on election day, throw out that ballot. So, if you're really concerned about some late-breaking development apparently that's possible. I had no idea.
I had no idea about that.
Yeah. But so I think, based on just the increases in registration and the feverish interest in this election, you're going to probably see quite a bit of activity at the polls. So, yeah, get there early, bring something to read. I don't know.
And you can register day of, Dan? I mean, you can show up and just register to vote and vote on next Tuesday.
Well, apparently that's not into a party, of course, so it doesn't matter. And so the answer is yes. I would look for problems in New Haven because Hartford and Bridgeport have had their turns in the recent two cycles.
I don't think it works that way.
So is it either New Haven or Waterbury where we're going to see the problems?
No, I don't think it works that way.
Well,
it's not like vaccinations. Like after you get the measles, you don't get them again.
That's right.
One thing that's kind of interesting is the Connecticut ballot is using the last names for the presidential candidates, not their entire names. So you would be voting for a Clinton or you'd be voting for a Trump. Of course, Trump is on a long line of all sorts of things from hotels to casinos to steaks to suits. Leah, I don't know. Clinton, a lot of people are wondering which Clinton is running, depending on what you hear Donald Trump saying. I mean, is this a problem that maybe you're voting for a Trump or a Clinton, not a Hillary or a Donald J?
I mean, he's branded hotels and clothes and steaks. Why not the presidency, right? I think that there are people who are considering. There's been a lot of work to connect Hillary Clinton to the bad parts of Bill Clinton. So there is a weird moment where you're looking at the ballot and you say, I'm voting for a Clinton or I'm voting for a Trump. It's kind of surreal, but I don't think necessarily in a way that goes beyond kind of eyebrows raised at a particular point in time. I think the much bigger concern is about these long lines on voting day, about accusations of voter fraud, of accusations or attempts at intimidation and attempts at really suppression.
Well, and I want to say one thing about this.
Please.
So just so people understand, the way the ballot's laid out in Connecticut, it's only the president and vice president are last names only. It says Clinton and Kaine, and it says Trump and Pence, and then all the other people on the down ballot have their full names, which I think is good because in the case of Beth Bye, people might think you don't vote that week or something. It's a bye week or something.
So so now we have that straight. But Leah, I mean, to this really important issue, and who knows how much it will happen in Connecticut, if at all. Who knows how much it will happen in some of the states in which we know that they'll go blue or red. But in a lot of states like North Carolina, like Ohio, like Florida, where the outcome of this election is really going to matter to the overall national election, how concerned are you that we will have people intimidating people at the polling places, or that we will have such chaos that we'll have very, very long lines and people won't get to actually cast their vote? I mean, even with all this early voting, there is still the specter hanging over this election that we may see a little bit more chaos than we've ever seen before.
Right. And so I think this was a real issue in 2012 that, politicians promised to address that no one has really addressed. In fact, I would be very concerned since a number of state legislatures have actually eliminated things that were designed to address that. Right. So North Carolina with early voting and cutting back a number of these state ID laws, which I think are actually an inaccurate description because they're not just about having some form of identification. They're about all the other ways that people vote. And in a number of studies pulled from the 2012 campaign, they actually found that it did affect voting. We have polling places closing. I think it was North Carolina that went from 16 polling places to one polling place between 2012 and 2016. These are things that do affect turnout and people's ability to vote. I think the other thing is that it's normal for political campaigns to have election observers, right? So people who can accuse people of fraud, people who can watch out for accusations of fraud. What is different is the idea of mobilizing a volunteer militia of sorts to, quote unquote, protect the polls against voter fraud, right? So there's that. There are those moments where we've heard from people who say, I'm literally going to intimidate people at the polls. You cannot do that. That is against the law. And yet that is what I would really be concerned about, particularly in these areas that, in this case, the Trump campaign has called out, like St. Louis, Chicago, Philadelphia, and other parts of the country.
Yeah. Colin, quickly on this?
The Republican National Committee is actually still under a consent decree that's been in place for decades because of, in fact, exactly the kind of stuff that Leah has been talking about in the past. So if they get involved in it, if it's traceable to them, they face a special judicial burden and possible enforcement actions. There's no question that this just stuff just goes on. That's the reason they've made 2 or 3 attempts to get that consent decree lifted, and no federal court will do it because it still goes on. They're still doing voter intimidation and suppression, voter ID laws, and situations where they make it very hard to get that voter ID.
Danny, quickly?
I don't think there's going to be any real intimidation. The problem is intimidation about intimidation. I shouldn't say there isn't going to be any. The problem is the fact that it's brought up.
Colin, there's a lot of things that you can learn about how to vote, where to vote from the Secretary of the State's office, but there's some things that are a little unclear. I mean, do you have to bring like a photo ID to actually vote?
It's really, really complicated. Technically, you don't, but you'll always be asked for one. There are other things that you can produce. This year, I've decided, I'm giving you fair warning, people at the polls. I'm going to see if I can vote without a photo ID, because we do say in other places that a photo ID requirement is essentially a repressive tool. I don't think it's that way in Connecticut, but if we really believe in that, then you should be able to vote without a photo ID.
Danny?
Just quickly looking at the weather forecast in swing states, Midwest for rain on Tuesday. Right now, that's in Ohio. That could be a significant factor, not a joke.
Well, it could be a factor. I mean, another quick factor we're going to try to figure out. Can you take a ballot selfie in Connecticut? Are you going to take one, Colin?
There are cases, Leah may know about this, there are cases all over the country right now about this ballot selfie question because people like to do it. It's kind of a Justin Timberlake-y kind of thing to do. You fill out your ballot, you color in, and then you take a selfie with your ballot. And it's illegal in some states, legal in other states. The American Civil Liberties Union has got involved here in some cases. Connecticut, as usual, has a very muddy situation. There's no specific statement anywhere about ballot selfies, but you can be disciplined for being kind of disruptive or causing too much trouble.
Federal court in Michigan said they can't outlaw it in that state. I don't know if that adheres elsewhere.
Should be a basic First Amendment thing. You should be able to do it unless you're slowing down the voting line.
All right. Lee, unless you have a quick thought on that, I'll just ask you to go to our outer sphere. We usually try to end the program with some things that we haven't talked about so far. I mean, what's on your mind this week? What's going on?
So 2 quick things. One, I will be doing election coverage live from Qatar, Doha for Al Jazeera next week, all of next week. Wow. So tune in if you want. The other thing is I've discovered the Hamilton CD, and I'm hooked. I can't stop singing along with it at the top of my lungs in my car.
Well, see,
I'm late to the party.
You're late to the party, not as late as I am. I'm still not into it, but there you go. I'm going to watch you next week on Al Jazeera. Danny, what's in your outer sphere?
3 photography events in Hartford, still on display at the Athenaeum. Samuel J. Wagstaff Jr., very important collection that became a cornerstone of the Getty. Kenneth Roberts, a photographer not well known, shot steam trains. His family donated that collection to the Cetacean, am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yes, you are.
Society, which is based here in Connecticut to preserve whales. So there's a Rails to Whales exhibit as part of Open Studio next week at 30 Arbor Street. And thirdly, Paula Bronstein, great photographer based in Bangkok, Thailand, has a new book out, which is Afghanistan Between Hope and Fear, award-winning book, already won a couple of big awards. Tomorrow night at the University of Hartford Entrepreneurial Center, a book talk, which will be sponsored by the World Affairs Council, and I'll be buying the wine and cheese.
Oh, very, very nice. Those are some good things. Colin?
So, Leah, it seems to me that the song that really, really resounds for this election is The World Turned Upside Down. Anyway, so Halloween night, I'm pulling into my driveway because there's kids all over the neighborhood in costumes, and there's this incredible kid in this fabulous bear costume, except then I realize it's a bear. And I've actually got 2 bears in my yard. And so then they start running. I live very near where the governor's mansion is, and he has a big trick-or-treating operation there. And the bears start running in that direction. And I'm thinking, bears are running towards little people holding bags of food. This is like really a bad thing. So I called the cops. I called the cops twice about it. I was so worried, and I guess nothing happened. But I do feel as though now that it's touched my own life, I mean, like, something horrible is going to happen. We're going to have to get better at this whole bear situation. Along with your EpiPen, you're going to have to take sort of a Marlon Perkins tranquilizer dart or something. Particularly when you go trick-or-treating. You're standing there with a bag of candy and there's a bear running towards you. What do you think is going to happen one of these days?
It's so very frightening. Just in my outage very quickly in the last minute I have, I just want to send along condolences to our friend and often one of our guests here in the Wheelhouse, Daniela Altamari, who lost her father, who has quite a remarkable American story, and it's a rather remarkable American obituary she wrote for her father. So condolences to Daniela and her family. I also want to say, look, tonight is the 7th game of the World Series, and it's one of the best things that can happen in America. And it's happening between two cities, Chicago and Cleveland, that have actually played a pretty substantial role in this political season. Cleveland, of course, hosted one of the conventions. It's also part of a state that's been denigrated time and time again as a place where all of the American jobs leave, and we're in this battleground state for the soul of poor Ohio. On the other side, there's Chicago. We can't have another moment on the Donald Trump campaign trail without talking about violence in Chicago. I wish the best to both of these cities tonight. One of you is going to feel really good tonight. One of you will still feel pretty good about what you did. 7th game of the World Series tonight. Hope you can join us next week to figure out how this all ends up in the Wheelhouse. Thanks for joining us.